Let's talk Gatling cannons and flamethrowers with a review of the two very tall knights just around the corner for Warhammer 40k, and talk through the datasheets of the Cerastus Knight Castigator and the Acheron. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a focus review of two of the new Cerastus Knights, the Gatling and Warblade wielding Castigator and the Chainfist and Flamer Acheron are both getting new plastic kits, replacing the resin Forge World kits, which should make them a lot more attainable for a lot more people. And with that in mind, I thought it could be fun to take a look at their rules both for Imperials and Chaos, and talk about which are doing well in game at the moment. These two new kits are coming out from Games Workshop, the Cerastus Knight Acheron and the Castigator. They should both be the same price as the Lancer that was released not so very long ago, £120, $200 or €155. Pretty pricey as both Games Workshop and Imperial and Chaos Knights go, more than most, though admittedly they are really quite big kits, standing quite solidly higher than even things like a Dominus Knight. And while the price tag maybe could have been a little bit lower, at least it's vastly lower than what Forgewell were asking for them before. If you were looking to pre-order them, then as ever I'd be tempted to order them through the third-party retailers that give you discounts, Element Games in the UK for around about 15% off, or Gap Games in Australia usually over 20% off. Both of those are links down in the video description, and any sales made through them do help to support Auspex Tactics and keep all these videos coming. At time of recording, it's basically the week before the pre-order. They'll go on for full pre-order on the 23rd of September and full sale on the 30th of September. Kits that seem to be primarily aimed at Horus Heresy and the Age of Darkness, but do equally have Warhammer 40k rules, which is what I wanted to talk about today. I know there's at least a fair few people out there who are looking forward to getting their hands on one of these though. Dropping down quite this significantly in price and also coming in plastic rather than resin are quite good advantages. In the lore, the Knight Castigator is the one that's equipped with the twin Gatling cannon. This one's usually employed as an anti-horde knight if the enemy comes in great numbers, and tends to be the steed of choice of venerable scions of the household who have been around really quite a long time. Among the Agile Cerastus class, it's seen as a bit more of a solid staple of a knight with a dependable machine spirit. The Acheron, on the other hand, with its enormous flamethrower and great big tank of fuel, that is seen as a weapon of burning terror and slaughter, not only aims to kill the enemy, but designed to stamp the Emperor's retribution right into the psyche of the people it oppresses, and as a result, as somewhat of an engine of slaughter, it's seen as an unpleasant duty to employ for other Imperials, though the scions of households fallen to Chaos take a rather different view of it. Let's start with that one first though, the flamethrowing Knight Acheron, and here is the datasheet for the Imperial Knights. It costs 445 points at time of recording. Really quite cheap as Imperial Knights go, though I do think that there's a reason for that. Starting out, the Cerastus chassis is pretty handy. It gets a big 12-inch move when the regular Questoris gets 10, so a little bit more agile there. And it does get a bit of a defensive increase. It goes up to 25 wounds rather than 22. And the only major potential downside is the chance of a slightly bigger explosion with an extra deadly demise of d6 plus 2 mortal wounds. Its combat profile maybe isn't the most exciting in the world. Both this and the Castigator essentially just have the profile for the Reaper Chainsaw but with a different name. Definitely no bad thing though. Either 4 attacks at strength 14 and damage 6, which is pretty brutal against heavies, or big 12 attacks at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 2, making it particularly good at killing things like standard sized Space Marines. The Acheron's primary armament is the Acheron Flame Cannon. This has got 18-inch range and is an auto-hitting weapon with 2d6 attacks, all striking home at strength 8, AP-1 and damage 2 and ignoring cover. I feel like Games Workshop maybe underestimated this one a little bit and it feels just a little bit underpowered. On average it kills around about 3 Space Marine Intercessors or 5 dead Imperial Guardsmen or Termagants. Definitely not terrible numbers, but I'd say not particularly outstanding for a primary weapon for an Imperial Knight. The Castigator definitely has those numbers beat, and perhaps more than anything else it absolutely hated the change to Overwatch that Knights had recently. Titanic units can now no longer Overwatch at all, and to my mind that probably takes the single biggest trump card that this Knight had in fairly powerful Overwatch, and as a result it does compare kind of poorly to the others now. I feel like at the very least probably the Flame Cannon should probably have been the equivalent of the Valiant style Flamestorm Cannon with 3d6 rather than 2d6. I think that would have been pretty reasonable. Otherwise though, it does have an auxiliary gun with a twin heavy bolter built into that chainblade, and it has 2 special rules: stripping cover from the unit that's targeted by the Great Big Flamer Cannon. Definitely not unhelpful in 10th edition when cover's quite so common, but overall I'd say it's not particularly outstanding when it's the primary weapon on a 445 point model. Finally, I think its bondsman ability is kind of bad now, definitely getting worse after the rules update that means that only armigers take advantage of it. It now means that bonded armigers that take the bondsman ability gets to inflict battle shock on the enemy in the fight phase. Usually that's just not really going to have much effect at all, besides stopping some defensive stratagems and things, as if it's in your own fight phase, then the enemy will basically heal that battle shock right at the start of their turn. Occasionally could be handy for end of turn secondaries, I suppose. Overall though, I must admit it's not particularly good news for the Acheron. Despite being a pretty cheap knight, it does have quite a lot of disadvantages. It's got a pretty underpowered main weapon, its special rule is kind of okay but nothing outstanding, and its bondsman ability is pretty bad. For the Chaos Marines, the vast majority of the datasheet is pretty much the same war gear stats, stat lines, and same special rule allowing you to strip cover from units, as well as just changing around the main faction special rules though that we'll get onto later. The main change between the Imperial and the Chaos datasheet is the replacement of the Bondsman ability. It gets a similar sort of special rule where war dogs within 6 inches of it get to inflict a battle shock test at the start of the fight phase with any units that they're engaged with, which at least from round 3 onwards could perhaps be a little bit more useful for Chaos Knights, could potentially give you a -1 to wound or a -1 to hit for the ensuing combat. It's still definitely kind of unreliable, as most battle shock is though, and I feel like it's maybe just not excellent with the slightly clunky positioning that you'll need. Trying to coordinate big models like this into combat and also have them fighting side by side isn't always going to work out. One might just not be able to make the charge, and sometimes you might have to charge out of range of the buff. I guess having more battle shock tests flying around is rarely going to be a terrible thing for the Chaos Knights though. I don't know if it's maybe perhaps because of that, but it does cost a little bit more than the Imperials, which I guess is the other major difference. It's 465 rather than 445, basically meaning that it's paying a 20-point premium compared with the Imperials, and I feel like it probably evens out at a bit of a side grade overall. Moving on to the Castigator though, and its fearsome Gatling cannon. For the Imperial datasheet, it's 485 points, has the same very nice Cerastus pattern stat line, and despite the very different appearance of the Tempest Warblade, again it still strikes in the same sort of way as a Reaper Chainsword would. For its main weapon though, it really is worlds apart for the Acheron, and easily worth the extra 40 points I think. The Castigator Gatling cannon really is pretty fearsome. It has the same base profile as the Avenger Gatling cannon, 18 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, but the Castigator gets twin linked into the bargain, so you get to re-roll the wound roll. It means that compared with the Avenger Gatling cannon, it's just going to be a lot better against punching up against tough stuff. An average volley kills around about 7 dead Space Marines, so over double the damage output of the Acheron against them. Kills around about 2 Terminators, also pretty good against those. And for light vehicles, anything that is not wounding on a 6 that's toughness 12 or above, it generally get quite a lot of wounds stacked on them. For example, it's around about 9 wounds to a Rhino tank with a 3+ save. Still definitely a little bit less efficient than against the infantry, but it's definitely not wasted. Its bondsman ability I'd also rate as decently better. For the armature it's targeting, they're going to get sustained hits 1 on their attacks and extra AP. This seems to be just excellent with Helverins to me. Extra shots is great, and getting those autocannons to more meaningful AP brackets is really big. You could potentially get one all the way up to AP -3, stacking Squire's Duty with it. He is definitely very sad that he can't use this bondsman ability on himself anymore. It did make the Gatling cannon just ridiculously scary with AP -3 and sustained hits. I think I would have personally still preferred a points increase if Games Workshop had to nerf them in some way, and keep the bondsman abilities the way they were, affecting the main knight and the armature. Finally, for a special rule, I'd say it's also quite useful. If he shoots something with his Gatling cannon, then the storm of bolts means that anything that isn't a monster or vehicle will be -1 to hit for the next turn. It's not always going to be useful, and certainly not if you just wipe out the enemy unit that you've shot at, but I guess it adds a bit of incentive to try and have him gradually cutting down an enemy Death Star type unit, maybe a really big block of Terminators or something like that, take out a couple of them, and then hopefully make the rest of the unit into a lot weedier damage output. I'd say that's really quite a nice rule to have, but maybe not super standout. For the Chaos version of the datasheet, again pretty much the same copy-paste as the Acheron had, bar the changing out of a bondsman ability for an aura. I guess for the Chaos Knights he might be competing against the double Gatling cannon despoiler if you just want an obscene amount of strength 6 and damage 2 shots, and he would quite like the +1 to wound if you can unlock it by making enemies battle shocked. +1 to wound and re-rolling all wounds means that they're going to take some hefty damage from that thing. For his aura boost though, I do think that that's particularly nice for Chaos. He gets an aura of sustained hits 1 for the ranged weapons of nearby war dogs. Really quite a solid boost to their ranged firepower overall. I feel like that could be a particularly nice one to have with the ever-popular Wardog Brigands. His buff does work out, just very slightly more efficient than the Knight Despoiler for the same role, but realistically there isn't really very much in it. I guess compared with the Desecrator, it does have the disadvantage of not being able to stack with the Dreadhound stratagem, which is a reasonable one for Wardogs trying to focus down one target. If they already have sustained hits, they're generally not going to get much from gaining more, though I suppose it could still be relevant if the target was battle shocked. Moving on to the buffs and synergies for the models, I'd say for the most part both of these knights just don't really do things massively different from the rest of the index. For the Imperials, a 6 plus feel no pain is never really a bad thing, and particularly if it goes to a 5 plus. The single rerolls will help out the units in melee a lot more than they do at range really. Neither of them particularly care about the range rerolls, as both units will often only benefit from one set of them on their main weapon, not both. Otherwise, for stratagems for the Imperials, rotate Ion Shields is generally going to be worth it on the big knights to get the 4 plus invulnerable save. Definitely if you think the unit's going to take some big firepower and get focused down. Trophy Claim could perhaps be interesting enough on the Castigator, which I think has enough firepower to make it work. You'd go from wounding on a 5 plus most of the time with that big Gatling cannon to a 4 plus with reroll wound rolls. It does sound quite impressive, but the actual damage output will be something like an extra 3 wounds against something like an enemy Rhino tank. It's definitely not nothing, but maybe not necessarily worth the 2 CP. I feel like the Gatling cannon with its lower strength is going to be a bit less reliable for finishing off enemy tanks than most perhaps. Valiant Last Stand can allow them both to fight in death, always good on big knights, though it does cost 2 CP now. And of course Tank Shock's pretty excellent whenever you're charging into melee with strength 14 weapons, a good chance for a whole bunch of mortal wounds. Overall, broadly I still say they just do what they do in a similar sort of way to pretty much all the other knights. The Castigator's biggest synergy is likely going to be with an Armiger Helverin for the extra AP and sustained hits. It is kind of a shame that he can't take the enhancement for Mythic Hero with that, that's locked to only Questoris. Otherwise being able to give 2 Helverins that buff would have been very good. Otherwise, for the Chaos, they've got their core Dread mechanics, which can do some early game battle shock, and then to start converting that into damage and -1 to hit later in the game, but it does happen from turn 3 onwards for most knights. I guess the Acheron is the one that plays into that a little bit more than the Castigator. He might potentially trigger some battle shock if he does manage to find himself in combat next to some War Dogs, like those new cheaper Carnivores perhaps. Will be handy when it gets +1 to wound, but in the early turns of the game it's likely just to be preventing stratagems. Otherwise, the same as most knights, Diabolic Bulwark for 1 CP for a 4 plus invulnerable save at range is good. The 1 CP for Feel No Pain in melee is quite nice, particularly if the enemy is battle shocked. And again, with the Acheron having the chance to throw out a few more battle shock tests, that could give you a chance to use some Terror Shades. I guess at least you'd be close enough to guarantee their use if you wanted. Otherwise, most of the normal enhancements are absolutely fine, the same on these as they would be on any. The Panoply of Cursed Knights for the AP debuff is quite nice, I think, as is the Traitor's Mark to give you the chance of getting +1 to wound a bit early. And as mentioned previously, I feel like the Castigator works quite well with some War Dog Brigands, giving them some sustained hits, so making their already good firepower even better. I guess you'd be debating between the tank busting fire of the Desecrator versus the Gatling cannon of the Castigator for that role. Overall, out of these 2 Cerastus Knights, I feel like the Acheron isn't really in a great place. Definitely the worst of the 2, particularly after the change to Overwatch, as I feel like that was really its only unique selling point versus the other Cerastus and Questoris or Abhorrence. I think it either needs a fairly sizable points decrease, or something like an extra d6 shots on its flamethrower. Otherwise, the Castigator I think is genuinely quite a lot better. I think its stat line and damage profile do compete fairly well with the other stronger Imperial and Chaos Knights, particularly when backed up by a bunch of Brigands for the Chaos Knights or an Armiger Helverin for the Imperials. I feel like it's efficient enough. The Gatling Cannon's very good, and its raw stat line and melee are fine as well. For competitors, the closest analogy for the Imperials would be the Warden. That one's 480 points, so near enough the same cost. I feel like the gap between the two has actually probably closed really quite a lot, given that the Bondsman abilities no longer affect the big knight. I feel like most people would probably have preferred the Warden while it was always -1 damage, but now I feel like the Castigator has got a lot more of an argument for it, as it's basically the tougher of the 2 per point with those 3 extra wounds. For Chaos, I'd see the main competitors as the Despoiler and Desecrator, the Despoiler with the Gatling cannons and the Desecrator for buffing nearby War Dogs. I feel like it's strong enough and has enough benefits to be considered next to those 2. Again, it maybe really depends on whether or not you think your list needs more anti-tank busting firepower or more Gatling shots. Realistically, these guys are just going to have to justify themselves versus literally any of the other big knights though. You can only have so many in a list. but at least I'd say that the Castigator is worthy of contention, where the Acheron really isn't right now. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on the new knights down in the comments below. Would you be tempted to try out a Knight Castigator? And would you agree with me that the Acheron is just a bit woefully underpowered right now? Or do you think that it still has a niche? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. The channel's Patreon is the primary thing that allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. It is what allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.